Brent. In the weeks since, he'd decided to ask her to marry him. They planned to be together that very night, Christmas Eve, the most wonderful night of the year. Once they were alone, away from family and friends, Len intended to propose. He loved Amy. He had no doubts about that. He wasn't a man who gave his heart easily, and he'd made sure, in his own mind at least, that marriage was what he truly wanted. In the weeks since their last meeting, he'd come to see that loving her was for real, and for always. They hadn't talked about marriage, not the way some couples did, but he was confident she loved him too. He paused for a moment and held in a sigh as the doubts came at him, thick as the falling snow. Lately, Len had noticed that Amy seemed less like her normal self. They hadn't talked much, not with him saving to buy the diamond, and it was difficult for Amy to call him at the base. So they'd exchanged letters. Light, newsy letters with little mention of feelings. He had to admit he found their letters enjoyable to read, and even to write, and the cost of stamps was a lot more manageable than some of his phone bills had been. The truth was, he couldn't afford to spend money on long-distance calls anymore. Not the way he had in previous months. His airfare home hadn't been cheap either. It wasn't as if he'd put off traveling until the last minute, which Amy seemed to suspect. He'd been on duty until the wee hours of this morning. He'd explained all that in a letter he'd mailed earlier in the week, when he'd sent her his flight information. Although Amy hadn't come right out and said it, he knew she'd been disappointed he couldn't arrive earlier. But that was Navy life. He hadn't received a letter from her in 10 days, which was unusual. Then again, perhaps not. After all, they'd be seeing each other soon. Amy and his parents were scheduled to pick him up in Dallas, and together they'd drive home to Rawhide. He closed his eyes and pictured their reunion, hoping the mental image would help calm his jangled nerves. It did soothe him, but not for long. He had to get home for Christmas. He just had to. This was Kathy Norris's first Christmas without Ron, and she refused to spend it in Maine. She'd buried her husband of 41 years that October. Her grief hadn't even begun to abate. The thought of waking up Christmas morning without him had prompted her to accept her daughter's invitation. She'd be joining Madeline and her young family in Boston for the holidays. Kathy had postponed the decision until last week for a number of reasons. To begin with, she wasn't a good traveler and tended to stay close to home. Ron, on the other hand, had adored adventure and loved trekking through the woods and camping and fishing with his friends. Kathy was more of a homebody. She'd never flown or taken the train by herself before, but then she was learning now to do a great many unfamiliar things on her own. In the past, Ron had always been with her, seen to their tickets, their luggage, and any unforeseen problems. He had been such a dear husband, so thoughtful and generous. The battle with cancer had been waged for a year. Ron had put up a gallant fight, but in the end, he'd been ready to die, far more ready than she was to let him go. Trivial as it seemed now, she realized that subconsciously she'd wanted him to live until after the holidays. Naturally, she'd never said anything. How could she, when such a request was purely selfish? It wasn't as if Ron could choose when he would die. Nevertheless, she'd clung to him emotionally far longer than she should have, until she'd painfully acknowledged that her fears were denying her husband a peaceful exit from life. Then, with an agony that had all but crippled her, she'd kissed him one final time. Holding his limp hand between her own, she'd sat by his bedside, loving him with her entire being, and waited until he'd breathed his last. Ron's death clouded what would otherwise have been her favorite month of the year. She found it devastating to be around others celebrating the season while she struggled to shake her all-consuming grief. She'd accepted Madeline's invitation as part of a concerted effort to survive the season of peace and goodwill.